turn the mic over to Lindsay Koshgarian.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks, Medea and Denise, for your really excellent talks on Iran and on and back from the brink efforts. Those are really important. I'm going to talk about the moral budget, which the Institute for Policy Studies put together with the Poor People's Campaign in 2019. And it's a comprehensive moral budget that addresses the interlocking injustices of poverty, racism, environmental degradation, and the war economy. And I'm going to talk about that budget, and then I'm also going to talk some about what it has to do with where we find ourselves today. So as I said, we released the moral budget in 2019. And of course, the major reasons to divest from nuclear weapons are not just about saving money. They are about making the world a safer place for us and everyone else in it. But nonetheless, there is a lot that we could do by cutting the nuclear weapons budget and using it to pay for other things. Now, the moral budget, as I mentioned, is a comprehensive budget. So it called for divesting from militarism more broadly, and that included cutting the total military budget nearly in half, defunding ICE, reforming border security, divesting from the war on drugs and the war on terror here at home, which have resulted in mass incarceration, the continuation of racist policing. Many of our most inhumane border policies have been justified by the war on terror, whether or not that was the actual motivation. And so we called for all of those things. But one of the key components of cutting the militarized budget is ending nuclear weapons. Now, in 2019, we recommended cutting $350 billion total from the military budget, but more than a tenth of that savings came from a transition to complete nuclear disarmament. At the time, we estimated that eliminating nuclear weapons could save the US more than $40 billion a year, and that was leaving some spending to take care of the costs of nuclear cleanup and dismantling in the short term and indefinitely. Since then, the nuclear weapons budget has actually increased, so the savings are likely to be higher now. Tim and Wallace, the Nuclear Ban US, has estimated that the savings could be closer to $70 billion a year, although we do need to recognize that some of that money would need to be put aside to dismantle weapons and to deal with the long-term. We all know how long-term the effects of nuclear weapons are, even once we are no longer actively maintaining and using them. So we wouldn't be able to save 100% of what the cost of nuclear weapons is today. But we could still do an awful lot with that money. Now, in the context of today, we're talking about things like $1.9 trillion aid packages in the national dialogue. So 70 billion is, even at the highest of what we could possibly save, is only a drop in that. But it's a lot with compared to nearly anything else that we invest in. And it adds up. Over the last decades, we've spent trillions of dollars building and maintaining nuclear weapons, building and maintaining the systems to deploy them, and all of the associated security that goes with that, and so on. Using that money, if we had, for instance, disarmed decades ago, we could have used the savings to transition to a clean energy grid, and we could have had a clean energy grid by now and saved untold emissions in the process. If we save the money now, here are some of the other things we could do. We could end homelessness in this country. We could close the racial funding gap in public schools. There's a funding gap of over $20 billion a year between government funding for primarily white versus primarily Black public schools. We could close that gap. Or we could meet the administration's new proposal as part of that 1.9 trillion COVID package for $20 billion for transportation, some of which would go into clean transportation, public transportation, and all of the things that we have not invested in this country for so long. Now, speaking of the new administration, of course, we're at a crossroads right now. We have this new administration, we have a Democratic majority in Congress, But we all know that this isn't a recipe for easy success when it comes to cutting military spending or ending nuclear weapons. So here's what we know about where we are now. We know that Chairman Adam Smith of the House Armed Services Committee has signaled an openness to rethink aspects of US nuclear power. He has doubts, especially about nuclear modernization, which were the plans to upgrade and in some cases build new nuclear weapons for the United States at a cost of $1 to $2 trillion in the coming years. So we know that he's signaled doubts about that. We also know that some members of the incoming administrations have signaled doubts about that. And the new administration, as has been discussed probably many times already today that I don't even know about, have signaled their intention to extend the New START treaty by 5 years, which is a crucial step and which is a huge step. And one that we were definitely not going to get under the last administration. So those are good things. But as Medea talked about, the signals on Iran right now are much more disturbing. We have not seen signals from the new administration that they plan to re-enter the Iran deal, aside from some pretty significant concessions on Iran's part. They haven't been clear about what kinds of concessions they would be looking for from Iran. But really what we would have hoped is that they would have said that they will enter back into the deal almost without any preset expectations of Iran. We are the ones who left the deal. We should be the ones to step back to it. So it's unfortunate that they don't seem ready to do that yet. Another more disturbing signal is the support from incoming members of the new administration for great powers competition. This is talking about China and Russia as the greatest threats to our security, which of course is nonsense. There are many greater threats to our security than either of those countries. And of course, there's, especially with regards to China, there's a bit of racism thrown in as well there. So that is extremely counterproductive, and it is what has been used to justify plans for nuclear modernization, plans for increasing nuclear spending, and continuing reliance on nuclear weapons and building the low-yield nuclear weapons and all of these things, and in continued increases in the military budget overall. The primary justification for those today inside Washington, D.C. is the notion of great powers competition, which is Russia and China. So we need to be very open in opposing that framework. And we've seen no openness to suggestions for things like turning the nuclear triad of nuclear deployment systems into a nuclear dyad, so that we'd only have 2 methods of deployment instead of 3. So things like that really seem to be almost non-starters in this administration. And that is something that we will need to work on. But there is hope on the budget. Our short-term goal for the nuclear budget can be stopping or significantly curtailing the plans for nuclear modernization. We have signals that this may be one of the more achievable goals that we have. Even if the total military budget doesn't decrease, the new administration has new priorities, places where they will want to spend money. They will need to shift things around and find savings somewhere, and nuclear savings may be one of those places. We need to keep an eye on the Biden budget release. We're expecting that we'll see what's called a skinny budget, which may not have any details about nuclear spending in February or possibly March, and then we'll see the full budget sometime later. But eventually there will be numbers put forth by the Biden administration for what they want to spend on nuclear weapons. And we need to before that comes out, we need to put out a lot of noise about making sure that they're spending less and that they're not going forward with nuclear modernization in particular. And then after it comes out, making noise about whatever the numbers are. But it's particularly important to make that noise beforehand, because especially on something like defense policy, the administration really sets the tone, and a lot of what they signal they want will be what gets rolled into the later actual legislation that Congress discusses and enacts. There's also the importance of how we talk about nuclear weapons. The nuclear ban treaty taking effect is of enormous importance and something we should continue to talk about as a lever to build support for US disarmament. It's such a unique moment. And we're also at a moment where there is suddenly sort of refreshed new attention to maintaining democracy in America. And what hasn't been talked about as much, but what we can talk about is maintaining global democracy and the importance of global democracy, and the fact that more upward of 80 countries have signaled support for this nuclear ban is something that we should be talking about, and that the United States needs to have respect, not just for democracy at home, but for democracy internationally. We can remind the public and legislators and members of the administration that the US has already supported the ban on chemical and biological weapons, and that this, on a moral basis and on a security basis, is no different. Those weapons are too dangerous to be allowed, and so are nuclear weapons. That should be a clear sort of moral equivalency. We should oppose the great powers competition framework like I talked about. We need to really be careful about how we talk about Russia, about China as adversaries, and talk more about the ways that we need to cooperate with those countries, about ways to use diplomacy to deal with the difficulties with those countries, which are real, but not about how we need to be in a military competition with those countries, which is what really threatens to take us into a new Cold War and would make the fight against nuclear weapons much, much harder. There are other things that folks have talked about: a no first use policy, limiting the president's power to unilaterally use nuclear weapons, which we all know we kind of dodged a big bullet there over the last 4 years. We need better diplomacy. We need to get back into the Iran deal. We're going to need new treaties. Global Zero's plan to get to nuclear disarmament starts with new treaties with Russia, and it starts with an amount of nuclear weapons that would be what experts consider adequate for deterrence and not for just outnumbering each other's nuclear weapons. Now, most of this goes down with Russia, of course, because the US and Russia are the two countries that have the vast majority of the world's nuclear weapons. We focus so much on countries like Iran and North Korea that it's easy to lose sight of that, but that is where it really needs to take place. And then we need to organize and build power. So one place that's doing that is obviously the Poor People's Campaign and the Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign that is putting together a moral budget for Massachusetts, and that is part of the National Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People's Campaign now is joining forces with the Congressional Progressive Caucus on many things to work together. And so that is a type of building power that I think could be very powerful, and I hope we'll see more of that going forward. We need to build support from other quarters besides the traditional peace community. We all know this. We need support from climate activists, and we are slowly building that, and we're getting support from Black Lives Matter and other really energetic, powerful movements that are with us today, but they need to be actively on the front with us on this. And in order to make that happen, we need to be actively on the front with them on their primary issues too. And then, like Denise talked about and others have talked about, local efforts can be extremely powerful. So passing something at a local level, at a state level, can be a really important step to build support and to build pressure that goes up the chain, but it needs to be happening in a lot of places at once. And I would welcome folks to use the trade-offs tool at nationalpriorities.org, where we have a calculator that you can use to see, if we defunded nuclear weapons, what could you get in your own community, your own city, your own county, your own congressional district for those savings. And that can be a really powerful tool with some of your local legislators as well. So I will stop talking now and hand it off to the next person.